On September 3, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany, and Winston Churchill returned to the Admiralty as First Lord. The board of the Admiralty signalled the fleet with a simple message: "Winston is back." He was 64 years old, and he had spent the better part of a decade warning anyone who would listen about the rise of Adolf Hitler and the danger of German rearmament. Most of the political establishment had ignored him, or worse, dismissed him as an alarmist and a warmonger past his prime. In the previous episode, we traced Churchill's path through the wilderness years of the 1930s, when he sat on the backbenches, excluded from power, writing and painting at Chartwell, while the Baldwin and Chamberlain governments pursued appeasement. We left him as he took up his old post at the Admiralty, the same office he had held during the First World War a quarter of a century earlier. The first months of the war did not go well for Churchill in that role. The Norwegian campaign of April 1940, an operation he had championed, ended in a chaotic withdrawal. British forces were outmanoeuvred by the Germans, and the House of Commons turned its fury on the government. In the famous Norway debate of May 7th and 8th, 1940, Conservative backbenchers savaged their own front bench. Leo Amery quoted Oliver Cromwell at Neville Chamberlain, "In the name of God, go." Labour called a division, and though Chamberlain survived the vote, his majority collapsed from over 200 to just 81. 41 Conservatives voted against him, and some 60 more abstained. It was the Norway debate that destroyed Chamberlain's authority, and the irony was sharp. Churchill bore considerable responsibility for the very campaign that brought the government down. Yet the parliamentary anger was directed at Chamberlain, and when it became clear that a national coalition was needed, Chamberlain had to go. What followed was the critical question of succession. On May 9th, Chamberlain met with Churchill and Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, at No. 10 Downing Street. The question hung in the air: which of the two men should take over? This episode will follow Churchill from that meeting in May 1940 through the war years. As he led Britain from the brink of defeat to victory, forged an alliance with Roosevelt and Stalin, and shaped the strategy that won the Second World War. We will then follow him through the shock of electoral defeat in 1945, his return to Downing Street in 1951, and ultimately his final years, his declining health, and his death in 1965. This is the story of Churchill's war and everything that came after. Part 1. Becoming Prime Minister and the May 1940 Crisis. The meeting at No. 10, on the evening of May 9, 1940, was one of the most consequential in British political history. Neville Chamberlain sat with the two candidates to succeed him, Winston Churchill and Lord Halifax. Also present was David Margesson, the government chief whip. Chamberlain still hoped to cling on, but the Labour Party had made clear they would only serve in a coalition under a new Prime Minister. The question was, which new Prime Minister? Halifax was, on paper, the establishment choice. He was trusted by the Conservative Party, liked by the King, and acceptable to Labour. He had served as Viceroy of India and had been Foreign Secretary since 1938. Many senior Conservatives, including Chamberlain himself, preferred him. Churchill was seen by much of his own party as erratic, unreliable, and too eager for a fight. His judgment was questioned. Gallipoli still hung over him. The Norway debacle was fresh. Chamberlain asked, in effect, which man it should be. There was a long pause. Churchill, by his own account, said nothing. He simply waited. It was Halifax who broke the silence. He said that as a member of the House of Lords, he would be unable to lead the government effectively from outside the Commons. The real business of wartime leadership would have to be conducted in the lower house, and a Prime Minister who could not appear there would be fatally hampered. This was Halifax's way of ruling himself out, and it settled the matter. Whether Halifax genuinely believed he could not govern from the Lords, or whether he simply lacked the appetite for what was coming, has been debated ever since. The result was the same. The following morning, May 10, 1940, Germany launched its invasion of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The phony war was over. That same day, Chamberlain resigned, and King George VI summoned Churchill to Buckingham Palace. The King, who would have preferred Halifax, received Churchill and asked him to form a government. Churchill accepted. He later wrote that as he went to bed that night, he felt a profound sense of relief and that he felt as if he were walking with destiny, and that all his past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. Churchill moved quickly. He formed a genuine coalition government, bringing Labour and the Liberals into the War Cabinet alongside Conservatives. Clement Attlee, the Labour leader, became Lord Privy Seal and effectively Deputy Prime Minister, though the title was not formalised. Arthur Greenwood, another senior Labour figure, also entered the War Cabinet. Chamberlain stayed on as Lord President of the Council, and Halifax remained Foreign Secretary. Churchill also took for himself the newly created title of Minister of Defence, giving him direct authority over the military chiefs. This was a crucial decision. It meant that Churchill, unlike any previous Prime Minister, had personal control over the strategic direction of the war. He chaired the Chiefs of Staff Committee whenever he wished and issued military directives under his own authority. He appointed General Hastings Ismay, known universally as Pug, as his chief military assistant and the link between the Prime Minister's office and the Chiefs of Staff. Ismay would become one of the most important figures in Churchill's war machine, a calm, tactful, and tireless operator who translated Churchill's torrents of ideas and demands into language the military bureaucracy could act on. Lord Beaverbrook, the Canadian-born press baron and Churchill's old friend, was given the Ministry of Aircraft Production, with a mandate to get fighter planes built as fast as possible by whatever means necessary. Beaverbrook attacked the job with ferocious energy, bullying manufacturers, raiding other departments for materials, and cutting through red tape. Fighter Command would soon need every aircraft he could produce. Churchill's first speech as Prime Minister came on May 13th when he addressed the House of Commons. He told the House that he had nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He defined the government's policy in a single sentence: to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. The reception in the House was notable. Labour and Liberal members cheered loudly. The Conservative benches were more muted. Many Tory members still regarded Chamberlain as their real leader, and they gave the departing Prime Minister a warmer ovation than his successor. Churchill's hold on his own party was far from secure in those early days. Meanwhile, the military situation was deteriorating with horrifying speed. The German attack in the west had unfolded with a precision and violence that stunned the Allied commanders. The main blow came not through Belgium, as the French and British had expected, but through the Ardennes forest in southeastern Belgium and Luxembourg. 7 panzer divisions under generals including Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel pushed through terrain the French had considered impassable for armour. They crossed the River Meuse at Sedan on May 13th and broke clean through the French lines. Within days, German tanks were racing across northern France toward the English Channel, threatening to cut off the entire British Expeditionary Force and the French First Army in Belgium. By May 20th, Guderian's panzers had reached the Channel coast at Abbeville. The Allied armies in the north were trapped. General Lord Gort, commanding the British Expeditionary Force, faced an impossible situation. The French High Command was in disarray. General Maxime Weygand, who had replaced the sacked Maurice Gamelin as Supreme Commander, drew up plans for a coordinated counterattack from north and south to cut the German corridor, but the forces and the coordination simply did not exist. Gort attempted a limited counterattack at Arras on May 21st using 2 battalions of infantry and 74 tanks. The attack caught Rommel's division off guard and briefly caused real alarm among the German commanders, but it was too small to change the strategic picture. Gort made a fateful decision. On May 25th, without waiting for authorization from London, he abandoned the Weygand plan and ordered his forces to fall back toward the Channel port of Dunkirk. It was a decision that saved the British Army. Churchill and the War Cabinet authorized the evacuation, codenamed Operation Dynamo, on May 26th. The evacuation was organized by Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay from his headquarters in the tunnels beneath Dover Castle. Ramsay had been pulled out of retirement at the start of the war and given command of the Dover station. He now performed one of the great feats of improvised military logistics. Over 9 days, from May 26th to June 4th, a fleet of naval vessels, merchant ships, ferries, fishing boats and civilian pleasure craft shuttled back and forth across the Channel under constant air attack. The Luftwaffe bombed the beaches and the harbour. The Royal Air Force, flying from bases in southern England, fought to provide air cover, though the soldiers on the beaches often could not see the air battles taking place at altitude and felt they had been abandoned. Over 338,000 Allied troops were brought back to England, including roughly 110,000 French soldiers. Virtually all of the army's heavy equipment, vehicles, and artillery was left behind on the beaches. Churchill addressed the House of Commons on June 4th, the day the evacuation ended. He warned the House that wars are not won by evacuations, and then delivered the passage that would become among the most famous words spoken in the English language during the 20th century. He declared that Britain would fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields and streets, and in the hills, and would never surrender. The speech was delivered to Parliament, and its full text was read later on the BBC by an announcer. Churchill himself did not broadcast it at the time, though many people later believed they had heard his voice. Yet even as Churchill rallied the nation in public, a fierce argument was unfolding behind closed doors. During the last days of May, as the Dunkirk evacuation hung in the balance, the War Cabinet met repeatedly to discuss whether Britain should explore the possibility of a negotiated peace. Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, argued that the government should at least find out what terms might be available, using Mussolini as an intermediary. He was not proposing surrender. His argument was pragmatic. If acceptable terms existed that preserved British independence and the Empire, it would be reckless not to explore them, especially with the army trapped in France and invasion, a real possibility. Churchill resisted. He argued that any approach to Mussolini or Hitler would be seen as weakness and would fatally undermine British morale and the willingness to fight on. Once you started down the path of negotiation from a position of weakness, he said, you could not control where it ended. The discussion went back and forth across 3 War Cabinet meetings on May 26th, 27th, and 28th. At times, the argument became heated. Churchill and Halifax came close to a genuine rupture. Churchill broke the deadlock on the afternoon of May 28 by taking the unusual step of convening the wider group of ministers outside the War Cabinet, some 25 men in all. He told them that he had considered whether it was part of his duty to consider entering negotiations with Hitler, and that he was convinced that every one of them would rise up and tear him down from his place if he were for one moment to contemplate parley or surrender. The ministers responded with an eruption of support. Some banged the table. Some came up and patted him on the back. Churchill returned to the War Cabinet and reported this response. Halifax's position was effectively finished. There would be no negotiation. This was, in many ways, the decisive moment of Churchill's premiership, and perhaps of the entire war. The decision to fight on, taken in a cramped room in the House of Commons by a small group of politicians during the last week of May 1940, determined the course of events that followed. Everything else, the Battle of Britain, the alliance with America and Russia, the eventual liberation of Europe, flowed from that choice. Part 2. Britain Alone, Summer and Autumn, 1940. The fall of France came with a speed that shocked the world. After Dunkirk, the Germans regrouped and launched their assault southward on June the 5th. The remaining French armies, depleted and demoralized, could not hold. Paris was declared an open city and occupied on June 14th. The French government, which had fled to Tours and then to Bordeaux, was tearing itself apart over whether to fight on or seek an armistice. Churchill flew to France repeatedly during these desperate weeks, trying to stiffen French resolve. He met with the French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, who wanted to continue the war, and with General Weygand and Marshal Philippe Pétain, who did not. The meetings were painful. Churchill spoke no French beyond a few phrases, and his passionate appeals for continued resistance ran up against the blunt reality that the French army was beaten and France itself was being overrun. At one meeting in Tours on June 13th, Churchill urged the French to hold on, to wage guerrilla war if necessary. Reynaud asked whether Britain would release France from its agreement not to make a separate peace. Churchill would not give a direct answer, saying only that Britain would not reproach France, but he wanted France to hold out long enough for America to enter the war. In a final, extraordinary gesture, the British War Cabinet on June 16th approved an offer of Anglo-French union, a proposal to merge the two countries into a single state with common citizenship, a joint parliament, and unified armed forces. The idea had been championed by Jean Monnet, the French economic planner, and enthusiastically backed by Charles de Gaulle, who was then a junior general serving as an undersecretary in Reynaud's government. De Gaulle telephoned the proposal to Reynaud in Bordeaux. Churchill and his war cabinet endorsed it, though several ministers had deep reservations about so radical a step. It hardly mattered. By the time the offer reached the French cabinet, Reynaud had already lost control. His ministers dismissed the proposal as an attempt to reduce France to a British dominion. That evening, Reynaud resigned. President Albert Lebrun asked Marshal Pétain, the 84-year-old hero of Verdun, to form a new government. Pétain immediately sought an armistice with Germany. France signed the armistice on June 22nd in the same railway carriage at Compiègne, where Germany had signed the armistice ending the First World War. Hitler staged the ceremony as a deliberate act of humiliation. Under the terms, Germany occupied northern and western France, including the entire Atlantic coast. The Pétain government established itself at Vichy in the unoccupied south. The French Empire, the French fleet, and the loyalties of French military commanders around the world were now uncertain quantities. The French fleet was the immediate crisis. It was the fourth largest navy in the world, and if it fell into German hands, the balance of naval power could shift catastrophically against Britain. The armistice terms stated that French warships would be disarmed under German and Italian supervision, and Hitler pledged not to use them. Churchill and the Admiralty did not believe this guarantee for a moment. The result was one of the most agonizing episodes of the war. On July 3, 1940, the Royal Navy acted simultaneously against French naval forces around the world. At Alexandria, a French squadron under Admiral René-Émile Godefroy was persuaded through patient negotiation by the British Admiral Andrew Cunningham to demobilize peacefully. At Plymouth and Portsmouth, French ships that had come to British ports were seized with minimal resistance, though there was some bloodshed. But at Mers el-Kebir, the French naval base near Oran in Algeria, events took a far darker turn. A powerful French force was anchored there, including the modern battleships Dunkirk and Strasbourg, under the command of Admiral Marcel Bruno Gensoul. Vice Admiral James Somerville, commanding the British Force H from Gibraltar, was ordered to present Gensoul with an ultimatum. Sail your ships to a British port, or sail to a French port in the West Indies where they could be demilitarized, or scuttle them within 6 hours. If none of these options was accepted, Somerville was to use force. Somerville was appalled by his orders. He considered the attack on a recent ally to be an act that was almost unthinkable, but he carried them out. The negotiations were botched on both sides. Gensoul refused to receive Somerville's emissary, Captain Cedric Holland, and instead dealt through a junior officer, which slowed communications and bred misunderstanding. Gensoul signaled the French Admiralty in Vichy, which ordered reinforcements to sail from Toulon. When British intelligence intercepted this signal, the time pressure intensified. Somerville opened fire at approximately 5:54 in the evening. The bombardment lasted roughly 10 minutes. The battleship Bretagne was hit in her magazines and blew up, capsizing with massive loss of life. The Dunkirk was badly damaged and ran aground. The Strasbourg, however, managed to slip out of the harbour under cover of smoke and escaped to Toulon with several destroyers. In total, 1,297 French sailors were killed. When Churchill reported the action to the House of Commons on July 4th, the House erupted in cheers from all sides. Churchill himself was in tears. The action horrified many, and it permanently poisoned relations between Britain and Vichy France. But it sent an unmistakable signal to the world, and above all to the United States, that Britain under Churchill would fight with absolute ruthlessness. Roosevelt's cabinet took note. So did the American public. With France gone, Britain faced Germany alone. The question was whether Hitler would invade. The German High Command drew up plans for a cross-channel assault, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, scheduled provisionally for mid-September 1940. The prerequisite was air superiority over the English Channel and southern England. Hermann Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler that his air force could destroy the RAF within weeks. The Battle of Britain began. The man responsible for the defence of British airspace was Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, who had commanded RAF Fighter Command since 1936. Dowding was an awkward, stubborn, and brilliant officer. He had fought successfully to prevent Churchill and the War Cabinet from sending more fighter squadrons to France during the May collapse, arguing that if too many were lost on the continent, Britain itself would be defenseless. He was proved right. Dowding had built the integrated air defense system that would now be put to the test, a network of radar stations along the coast, a ground observer corps to track aircraft inland, and a centralized command and control system that allowed fighter squadrons to be directed to where they were most needed. The frontline defence fell to 11 Group, covering London and southeast England, commanded by Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, a New Zealander who had been a fighter pilot in the First World War. Park's pilots bore the heaviest burden of the battle. To the north, 12 Group was commanded by Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, and the two men clashed bitterly over tactics. Park favoured scrambling small numbers of fighters quickly to intercept incoming raids before they reached their targets. Leigh-Mallory advocated assembling large formations, so-called big wings, to meet the enemy in force. The dispute became acrimonious and personal and would have consequences for both men after the battle. The German air offensive began in earnest in July, with attacks on Channel convoys and coastal ports. In August, the Luftwaffe escalated to direct attacks on RAF airfields and the radar stations. This was the most dangerous phase for fighter command. The airfields at Manston, Biggin Hill, Kenley, and others in the southeast were bombed repeatedly. Ground crews worked to fill craters and keep the runways operational. Losses among pilots were heavy. Fighter command was stretched thin. Dowding and Park were feeding fresh pilots into the battle with minimal training, and the attrition rate was alarming. Then, on September 7th, the Germans made a fateful shift. After a small RAF raid on Berlin, carried out in retaliation for bombs that had fallen on London, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to switch its attacks from the airfields to London itself. Goering believed that mass bombing of the capital would break British civilian morale and force fighter command to commit its last reserves in defence of the city. The first massive raid hit the London docks and the East End on the afternoon of September 7th. Fires burned along the Thames. Over 400 civilians were killed that day. The Blitz had begun. The switch to bombing London was a strategic error. It gave fighter command's battered airfields time to recover. The radar stations, most of which had survived the earlier attacks, continued to function, and the massed German formations flying to London presented concentrated targets for Park's fighters. On September 15th, the Luftwaffe launched what it intended to be a decisive blow against London. Park committed every available squadron. The German formations were met in wave after wave and suffered heavy losses. The RAF claimed to have shot down 185 aircraft that day, a figure that was greatly exaggerated in the heat of battle. The actual German losses were closer to 60. But the psychological impact was enormous. 2 days later, on September 17th, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion threat was over, though the British did not know it with certainty for some time. Churchill followed the battle closely. He visited Park's operations room at Uxbridge on several occasions, watching as the markers on the plotting table showed incoming raids and the squadrons sent up to meet them. During one visit in September, he asked Park what reserves were available. Park replied that there were none. Every squadron was in the air. It was after one such visit that Churchill remarked to Ismay, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." He later used the phrase, "in the House of Commons," on August the 20th, referring to the fighter pilots of the RAF. Churchill's personal style of wartime leadership was now fully established. He worked from the Cabinet War Rooms, a complex of reinforced basement rooms beneath the Treasury building on King Charles Street, just off Whitehall. The map room, staffed around the clock by officers from all three services, tracked the progress of the war across every theatre. Churchill's private office, his bedroom, and a small room disguised as a personal lavatory but actually containing a direct telephone line to President Roosevelt were all part of the underground complex. In practice, Churchill spent relatively little time underground. He preferred to work from the number 10 annex above the war rooms and to visit bombed areas in person. His routine was unlike anything the civil service or the military had encountered. He worked from bed in the mornings reading papers and dictating a stream of memoranda and minutes to his secretaries. He took a bath, often continuing to dictate while in it. He napped for an hour in the afternoon, a habit he credited with allowing him to work effectively into the small hours. His evening meetings and dinners frequently ran past midnight, sometimes past 2 in the morning. Staff officers, private secretaries, and ministers all had to adapt to his hours. The memos marked "Action this day," demanded immediate responses, and kept the machinery of government running at a pace Churchill considered acceptable. He was a difficult and demanding leader. He bullied subordinates, changed his mind unpredictably, championed impractical schemes, and interfered relentlessly in operational details. The chiefs of staff, particularly the chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir John Dill, and later Sir Alan Brooke, spent enormous energy managing Churchill, arguing him out of bad ideas, and protecting the professional military judgment from his enthusiasms. Brooke's diaries, published after the war, reveal the strain this imposed. But Churchill also inspired, energized, and drove the war effort with a force of personality that nobody else in British public life could have matched. The Blitz continued through the autumn and winter of 1940 and into the spring of 1941. London was bombed for 57 consecutive nights starting on September 7th. Other cities were hit hard. Coventry was devastated on November 14th in a raid that destroyed the medieval cathedral and much of the city centre. Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, Bristol, Southampton, and Plymouth all suffered heavy attacks. Over 43,000 civilians were killed during the Blitz, and over 1 million homes were damaged or destroyed in London alone. Churchill made a point of being visible. He toured bombed streets, inspected damage, and talked to people who had lost their homes. He wore his distinctive siren suit and carried a walking stick. He flashed the V for Victory sign. Photographs of him picking through rubble with a cigar clamped between his teeth became some of the defining images of the war. When Buckingham Palace was bombed on September 13th, King George and Queen Elizabeth were in residence. The Queen famously remarked that she was glad the palace had been bombed because she could now look the East End in the face. The shared experience of the Blitz, the sense that everyone from the King downward was in it together, became central to the national story of the war, even though the reality was more complicated and the poorest areas suffered the most. By the spring of 1941, Britain had survived. The invasion had been averted, the RAF had held, and the country was still fighting. But Britain could not win the war alone. Churchill knew it. Everything now depended on bringing the United States into the conflict and on keeping the Soviet Union in the fight once Hitler turned east. The next phase of the war would be fought as much through diplomacy and alliance building as through military operations. Part 3. Forging the Grand Alliance. Churchill's effort to draw the United States into the war had been underway since the fall of France. He and President Franklin Roosevelt had begun corresponding in September 1939 when Churchill returned to the Admiralty. Churchill signed his messages, "Former naval person," a reference to his earlier stint as First Lord. The correspondence grew into one of the most important diplomatic exchanges of the 20th century, eventually running to nearly 2,000 messages over the course of the war. Roosevelt was sympathetic to Britain's cause, but he faced enormous constraints. The United States was officially neutral. The Neutrality Acts, passed in the 1930s, restricted American arms sales and financial dealings with belligerent nations. Public opinion was deeply divided. A powerful isolationist movement, championed by figures like the aviator Charles Lindbergh and the America First Committee, argued that the European war was none of America's business. Roosevelt had won re-election in November 1940 on a promise to keep American boys out of foreign wars. He meant to help Britain, but he had to do it carefully, step by step, always with one eye on Congress and the public mood. The first major step was the destroyers for bases deal in September 1940. Britain desperately needed escort vessels to protect Atlantic convoys from German U-boats. Roosevelt agreed to transfer 50 aging American destroyers to the Royal Navy in exchange for 99-year leases on British naval and air bases in the Caribbean and Newfoundland. The destroyers themselves were of limited military value, many of them dating from the First World War. But the deal established the principle of active American material support for Britain, and it gave the United States a strategic foothold in the Atlantic. The far more significant development came in early 1941. Churchill had written Roosevelt a long letter in December 1940, laying out Britain's financial and material situation with brutal honesty. Britain was running out of dollars, and it could no longer afford to pay cash for American weapons and supplies. Roosevelt's response was the Lend-Lease Act, which he introduced to Congress in January 1941 and signed into law on March 11th. The legislation authorized the president to lend, lease, or otherwise transfer defense materials to any country whose defense he deemed vital to the security of the United States. Roosevelt explained the concept to the American public with a homely analogy. If your neighbor's house was on fire, you would lend him your garden hose and worry about getting it back later. Lend-Lease eventually channeled over $31 billion in aid to Britain over the course of the war, along with substantial amounts to the Soviet Union and other allies. It was, as Churchill later described it, the most unsordid act in the history of any nation. In January 1941, Roosevelt sent his closest personal advisor, Harry Hopkins, to Britain on a fact-finding mission. Hopkins was a gaunt, sickly man who suffered from chronic digestive illness and lived, improbably, in the White House itself. He had no official title beyond Special Assistant to the President, but he was Roosevelt's most trusted confidant, and his opinion would carry decisive weight. Hopkins spent several weeks in Britain, meeting Churchill, observing the war effort, and assessing whether the British could hold out. Churchill took him everywhere, to bombed cities, to military installations, to dinners that ran into the small hours. Hopkins was impressed by Churchill's energy and by the determination of the British people. At a dinner in Glasgow, Hopkins quoted from the Book of Ruth, "Whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." Churchill wept. Hopkins returned to Washington and told Roosevelt that Britain could survive and that helping Britain was in America's interest. While Churchill courted Roosevelt, the war in the Mediterranean and North Africa was producing mixed results. In late 1940 and early 1941, General Archibald Wavell, the British Commander-in-Chief Middle East, had achieved a stunning victory against the Italians in Libya. Italy had entered the war in June 1940, and in September, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani had led a large Italian force across the Egyptian border into Libya. The Italians advanced about 60 miles and then stopped, building a chain of fortified camps. In December, Wavell launched Operation Compass, a limited counterattack commanded by Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor. O'Connor's Western Desert Force, never more than about 30,000 men, smashed through the Italian positions and chased the retreating Italians westward across Libya. By February 1941, O'Connor had advanced over 500 miles, captured Benghazi, and taken approximately 130,000 Italian prisoners. The Italian 10th Army had effectively ceased to exist. It was one of the most complete victories in British military history, and Churchill was exhilarated. But then he made a decision that Wavell and many historians have criticized ever since. In February, intelligence confirmed that Hitler was sending German forces to North Africa to prop up his Italian ally. At the same time, Germany was preparing to invade Greece, which had been fighting the Italians since October 1940. Churchill decided that Britain must honor its guarantee to Greece and ordered Wavell to divert troops from the Desert Campaign to send an expeditionary force to the Greek mainland. Wavell complied, though he had reservations. O'Connor's advance was halted. The best Commonwealth divisions were pulled out of Libya and shipped to Greece. The expeditionary force, commanded by General Henry Maitland Wilson, arrived in Greece in March. It was too small to alter the outcome. When the Germans invaded Greece on April 6th, the Greek army and the British force were quickly overwhelmed. The British began evacuating by sea in late April, and the campaign ended in yet another withdrawal, with the loss of over 12,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, along with most of their equipment. Worse followed on Crete. Many of the troops evacuated from Greece were sent to the island of Crete, which the Germans attacked on May 20th with a massive airborne assault. German paratroopers and glider-borne infantry seized the airfield at Malmö after fierce fighting. The garrison, commanded by the New Zealand General Bernard Freyberg, fought hard, but was unable to dislodge the Germans from the airfield, which allowed the enemy to fly in reinforcements. After 10 days of fighting, another evacuation was ordered. The Royal Navy suffered heavily in the waters around Crete, losing 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers to German air attack. Meanwhile, in Libya, the German intervention had transformed the situation. General Erwin Rommel arrived in Tripoli in February 1941 with the leading elements of what would become the Africa Corps. Rommel was under orders to hold a defensive position, but he had no intention of waiting. In late March, he attacked. The weakened British forces in Libya, stripped of their best formations for the Greek expedition, crumbled. Within 2 weeks, Rommel had driven the British back across nearly all the territory O'Connor had won. O'Connor himself, sent forward to try to stabilize the situation, was captured when his staff car ran into a German patrol. Tobruk held out as an isolated fortress behind German lines, but the rest of Cyrenaica was lost. Churchill's relationship with Wavell deteriorated sharply during these months. Churchill bombarded Wavell with telegrams demanding offensive action, and Wavell, a quiet and reserved man who communicated poorly with politicians, struggled to explain the constraints he faced. Churchill came to believe that Wavell lacked the fighting spirit required. In July 1941, he replaced Wavell with General Claude Auchinleck as Commander-in-Chief Middle East. Wavell was sent to India as Commander-in-Chief there, a position of importance but away from the main theatre that occupied Churchill's attention. Then, on June 22, 1941, everything changed again. Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, with over 3 million German troops attacking along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Churchill had received intelligence warnings, partly from ultra-decrypts of German signals, and had even sent a personal warning to Stalin in April. Stalin ignored it, trusting in the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 and suspecting British provocation. Churchill had spent his entire political career as one of the most vocal opponents of Bolshevism. He had championed military intervention against the Soviet Union in 1919 and 20. He despised everything the Soviet system stood for. None of that mattered now. On the evening of June 22nd, Churchill broadcast to the nation and announced that Britain would give whatever help it could to Russia and the Russian people. He made no attempt to pretend he had changed his views about communism, telling listeners that if Hitler invaded hell, he would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. The alliance with the Soviet Union, born of necessity and mutual suspicion, would become one of the defining relationships of the war. In August 1941, Churchill crossed the Atlantic aboard the battleship HMS Prince of Wales to meet Roosevelt in person at Placentia Bay, Newfoundland. It was their first wartime meeting, though they had met once before, briefly in 1918, an encounter Roosevelt remembered but Churchill had apparently forgotten. The two leaders spent several days together aboard their respective warships, attended a joint church service on the deck of the Prince of Wales, and produced the Atlantic Charter, a declaration of shared principles for the post-war world. The Charter called for self-determination, free trade, freedom of the seas, and the abandonment of territorial aggrandizement. It would later form the basis of the United Nations Declaration. More practically, Churchill and Roosevelt discussed the Battle of the Atlantic, the supply situation, and the growing threat from Japan. Roosevelt was edging the United States closer to belligerency. American warships were already escorting convoys part-way across the Atlantic, and there had been incidents with German U-boats. But the president still could not take America to war without a catalyzing event. That event came on December 7, 1941. The Japanese attacked the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and killing over 2,400 Americans. Churchill was at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence, that Sunday evening, having dinner with the American ambassador John Wynant and Averell Harriman, Roosevelt's special envoy to Britain. They heard the news on a small radio that Churchill's butler Sawyers had brought into the room. Churchill immediately telephoned Roosevelt, who confirmed the attack. Churchill later wrote that he went to bed that night and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful, knowing that the United States was now fully in the war. Within days, Hitler made what many historians regard as his greatest strategic blunder. On December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. They were under no obligation to do so under the Tripartite Pact, which was a defensive alliance that did not apply because Japan had been the aggressor. But Hitler, contemptuous of American military power and furious at Roosevelt's unneutral conduct, made the declaration anyway. It solved Roosevelt's political problem. American public opinion after Pearl Harbor was overwhelmingly focused on Japan, and there was no guarantee that Congress would have declared war on Germany without German provocation. Churchill moved fast. On December the 22nd, he arrived in Washington for the Arcadia Conference, the first major Anglo-American strategic summit. He stayed at the White House as Roosevelt's personal guest, an arrangement that had its practical advantages for close consultation and its personal complications. Churchill wandered the corridors at all hours, appeared in Roosevelt's study unannounced, and on one occasion was discovered by Roosevelt in his bedroom completely naked, having just emerged from the bath. The critical strategic decision confirmed at Arcadia was Germany first, the principle that the European theatre would take priority over the Pacific. This had been agreed in outline in pre-war staff talks, but Churchill needed to ensure it held now that America's immediate fury was directed at Japan. It held. The two allies also agreed to establish a combined Chiefs of Staff committee in Washington to coordinate the war effort. While in Washington, Churchill addressed a joint session of Congress on December the 26th. He opened with a joke about his American mother, saying that if his father had been American and his mother British, rather than the other way around, he might have got there on his own. The line drew laughter and applause and established an immediate rapport. During this visit, Churchill suffered a heart attack. On the night of December 26th, after struggling to open a stiff window in his White House bedroom, he felt a dull pain in his chest and shortness of breath. His doctor, Sir Charles Wilson, later Lord Moran, examined him the next morning and diagnosed a cardiac episode. Wilson made a calculated decision to say nothing, reasoning that if he told Churchill to rest, Churchill would ignore him, and that if the diagnosis became public, the political consequences would be severe. Churchill carried on with his schedule, which included a flight to Ottawa, where he addressed the Canadian Parliament. The heart attack remained secret for years. Part 4. The Hinge of Fate. 1942 opened with a cascade of disasters in the Far East. The Japanese, having struck Pearl Harbor, moved with extraordinary speed across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. On February 15, 1942, the British fortress of Singapore fell. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, commanding over 80,000 British, Australian and Indian troops, surrendered to a Japanese force roughly half that size, commanded by General Tomoyuki Yamashita. The Japanese had advanced down the Malay Peninsula in just 70 days, outflanking defensive positions, using bicycles to move infantry along jungle tracks and repeatedly wrong-footing the British commanders. Percival's surrender was the largest capitulation in British military history. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The photograph of Percival walking to the surrender ceremony carrying a white flag became an enduring symbol of imperial humiliation. The fall of Singapore shattered the prestige of the British Empire in Asia. Burma was invaded next, and by May the British had been driven out, retreating through the jungle into India. Hong Kong had already fallen on Christmas Day 1941. The Dutch East Indies followed in March. Japan now controlled a vast swathe of territory, stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific. Churchill faced serious questions in Parliament about the conduct of the war and the failures of command in the Far East. In North Africa, the situation was scarcely better. Auchinleck had launched an offensive, Operation Crusader, in November 1941, which succeeded in relieving the besieged garrison at Tobruk and drove Rommel back into western Libya. But Rommel counterattacked in January 1942, pushing the British back to the Gazala line, roughly 40 miles west of Tobruk. There, the front stabilized for several months, while both sides built up their strength. In late May, Rommel struck again. The Battle of Gazala was a sprawling, confused engagement that lasted 3 weeks. Rommel swung his armoured forces around the southern end of the British minefields in a wide flanking move. The fighting was intense, and at times Rommel's position looked desperate, his tanks cut off from their supply lines. But the British response was disjointed. Individual brigade positions, known as boxes, fought hard, but were defeated in detail because the armour that was supposed to support them was committed piecemeal. The South African garrison of the Knightsbridge Box and the Free French Brigade at Bir Hakeim both fought tenaciously, but the overall battle was lost. The British retreated eastward. Then came the blow that struck Churchill hardest. On June the 21st, Tobruk fell. The port that had held out for 8 months during Rommel's first advance in 1941 surrendered in a single day. Roughly 25,000 South African, British and Indian troops were captured, along with enormous quantities of fuel, food and transport that Rommel desperately needed and immediately put to use. Churchill was in Washington when he received the news. He was in the Oval Office with Roosevelt, discussing strategy, when a secretary brought in a telegram. Roosevelt read it and passed it to Churchill without a word. Churchill later described the moment as one of the heaviest blows he received during the war. He was staggered by the speed of the collapse and by the sheer number of prisoners taken. Roosevelt's response was immediate and generous. He asked simply what he could do to help, and ordered 300 Sherman tanks and 100 self-propelled guns to be shipped to Egypt as rapidly as possible. The tanks were taken from American armored units that needed them for their own training. It was an act of Allied solidarity at a moment when Churchill badly needed one. At home, political pressure was building. The string of defeats, from Singapore to Tobruk, led to a formal vote of no confidence in the House of Commons, tabled on July 1, 1942, by Sir John Wardlaw Milne, a Conservative backbencher and chairman of the influential Select Committee on National Expenditure. The motion called for the central direction of the war to be placed in the hands of a single commander, separate from the Prime Minister. Wardlaw Milne undermined his own case spectacularly during the debate by suggesting that the Duke of Gloucester, the King's brother, should be made Commander-in-Chief, a proposal so bizarre that it drew laughter from all sides and deflated the attack. Aneurin Bevan, the fiery Welsh Labour MP, made a more serious and cutting speech, arguing that Churchill won debate after debate in the House but lost battle after battle abroad. Churchill defended himself vigorously in a 3-hour closing speech. The vote went 475 in his favour to 25 against. It was an overwhelming margin, but Churchill knew the criticism had substance. Something had to change in the desert. In August 1942, Churchill flew to Cairo. It was a grueling journey via Gibraltar and across the Western Desert in an unheated Liberator bomber at high altitude, wearing an oxygen mask. He arrived exhausted and immediately plunged into the question of command. After visiting the front and consulting with Field Marshal Jan Smuts, the South African Prime Minister who was in Cairo at the time, and with Sir Alan Brooke, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff who had accompanied him, Churchill decided on sweeping changes. Auchinleck was replaced as Commander-in-Chief Middle East. Churchill had originally wanted General William Gott, known as Strafer Gott, a popular desert commander, to take over the 8th Army. But on August the 7th, the transport aircraft carrying Gott to Cairo was shot down by German fighters, and Gott was killed. The command fell instead to Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, who had been slated to lead the British contingent for the planned Anglo-American landings in North Africa later that year. General Harold Alexander, a calm, aristocratic guardsman who had led the rear guard at Dunkirk and commanded the last phase of the Burma retreat, was appointed Commander-in-Chief Middle East in Auchinleck's place. Churchill liked Alexander personally and trusted his steadiness, but it was Montgomery who would transform the situation on the ground. Montgomery arrived in the desert on August the 13th and immediately made his presence felt. He was vain, abrasive, tactless, and supremely confident. He announced that there would be no more retreats and no more looking over shoulders. He visited every unit he could reach, showed himself to the troops, and imposed his personality on the 8th Army with a force that some found inspiring and others found insufferable. He wore a beret with 2 cap badges, an affectation that became his trademark. He insisted on thorough preparation and would not attack until he was certain he had superiority in men, tanks, guns, and supplies. This methodical approach infuriated Churchill, who was desperate for an early offensive. Brooke had to shield Montgomery from Churchill's impatient demands on multiple occasions. Rommel made one last attempt to break through to the Suez Canal. At the end of August, he attacked at Alam el Halfa, south of the El Alamein position. Montgomery, forewarned by ultra-intelligence decrypts that revealed Rommel's plan, positioned his defences to meet the attack and defeated it in 3 days. Rommel, short of fuel and under constant air attack, pulled back. It was a defensive victory, but it confirmed Montgomery's grip on the army and shattered any remaining German hope of reaching Egypt. Then came the offensive. Montgomery spent weeks building up his forces, accumulating over 1,000 tanks against Rommel's 500, and achieving a significant advantage in artillery and air power. The Second Battle of El Alamein began on the evening of October 23, 1942, with a massive artillery barrage from over 800 guns. The battle lasted 12 days and was a grinding, attritional fight through deep minefields and fortified positions. It was methodical and costly, and at times progress was desperately slow. Churchill grew anxious and pressed for faster results. Brooke again had to resist, assuring Churchill that Montgomery knew what he was doing. By November 4th, Rommel's line had broken. The Afrika Korps began retreating westward. Rommel wanted to withdraw earlier, but Hitler sent a stand-fast order that delayed the retreat and led to the destruction of much of the Italian infantry, which lacked transport to escape. Montgomery was criticized afterward for the slowness of his pursuit, and there is substance to the criticism. Rommel escaped with the core of his armored force and would fight on for months in Tunisia. But El Alamein was a decisive turning point. Churchill later wrote that before Alamein there had never been a victory, and after Alamein there was never a defeat. The statement was an exaggeration, but it captured the psychological shift. Church bells rang across Britain for the first time since the start of the war. 4 days after the breakout at El Alamein, on November 8, 1942, a combined Anglo-American force landed in French North Africa. Operation Torch, the first major American ground operation in the European theatre, put troops ashore at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. The overall commander was Lieutenant General Dwight Eisenhower, a relatively unknown American officer who had never commanded troops in combat. Eisenhower had been selected in part for his ability to manage the complex politics of an Allied coalition. The landings brought immediate political complications because French North Africa was controlled by the Vichy government, and the loyalties of the French military commanders there were uncertain. The most controversial episode involved Admiral François Darlan, the commander-in-chief of Vichy French forces, who happened to be in Algiers visiting his sick son when the landings occurred. Eisenhower's political representative, Robert Murphy, negotiated a deal with Darlan. In exchange for ordering French forces to cease fire, Darlan would be recognized as the French political authority in North Africa. The arrangement was pragmatic and it worked militarily, ending French resistance quickly. But it caused an uproar in Britain and America. Darlan was a senior collaborator with the Nazis, and doing business with him seemed to betray the principles the Allies claimed to be fighting for. De Gaulle, leading the Free French from London, was furious and felt sidelined. The crisis was resolved in the grimmest possible way when a young French monarchist named Fernand Bonnier de la Chapelle assassinated Darlan on December 24, 1942. In January 1943, Churchill and Roosevelt met at Casablanca in Morocco for their next strategic conference. Stalin was invited but declined, saying he could not leave the Soviet Union during the Battle of Stalingrad. The conference produced two significant outcomes. The first was the decision on the next phase of the war in Europe. The Americans, led by General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, had wanted to proceed directly to a cross-channel invasion of France in 1943. The British argued that this was premature, that the Allies lacked sufficient trained troops, landing craft and air superiority, and that the U-boat threat in the Atlantic had to be brought under control first. Churchill and Brooke pushed for the invasion of Sicily as the next step, keeping the pressure on through the Mediterranean. The British prevailed, and the Casablanca Conference confirmed that Sicily would be invaded in the summer of 1943. The cross-channel invasion was pushed to 1944. The second outcome was Roosevelt's announcement at the closing press conference that the Allies would accept nothing less than the unconditional surrender of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Churchill was sitting beside Roosevelt when he said it. Whether Churchill was surprised by the statement has been debated. Churchill later said he had not been consulted in advance, though the records suggest the concept had been discussed and Churchill had raised no objection. The policy of unconditional surrender was later criticized for stiffening enemy resistance and making it harder for internal opposition groups within Germany to negotiate. But at the time, it served to reassure Stalin that the Western Allies would not make a separate peace. Churchill's dealings with Stalin were among the most difficult and important of the war. In August 1942, Churchill had flown to Moscow to deliver unwelcome news in person. He had to tell Stalin that there would be no second front in France in 1942, despite earlier indications to the contrary. The meeting was brutal. Stalin accused the British of cowardice and of being afraid to fight the Germans. Churchill listened to the insults, controlled his anger, and then explained the Allied strategy using a sketch of a crocodile. He told Stalin that while the Allies prepared to strike the belly of the crocodile in the Mediterranean, they would also attack the hard snout with the cross-channel invasion when the time was right. He also told Stalin about the planned torch landings. Stalin's mood improved when he grasped the scale of the operation and its potential to open a new front against the German and Italian forces. The two men parted on better terms than seemed possible after the first session, but the fundamental tension over the second front would persist for another 2 years. The North African campaign ground on through the winter and spring of 1943. Rommel, now reinforced through Tunisia, fought a sharp defensive action and inflicted a painful defeat on inexperienced American forces at the Kasserine Pass in February. The Americans learned hard lessons and recovered. By May, the combined British, American and French forces had cornered the remaining Axis troops in northern Tunisia. On May 13th, approximately 230,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered. The entire North African coast was now in Allied hands. The Mediterranean was open, and the invasion of Sicily was next. Part 5. D-Day, Victory and the Bomb. The invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, was launched on July 10, 1943. It was the largest amphibious operation the world had yet seen, putting approximately 160,000 troops ashore on the first day. Montgomery's 8th Army landed on the southeastern coast and Patton's U.S. 7th Army on the south. The campaign lasted 38 days. Patton drove his forces hard, racing to capture Palermo and then Messina, partly motivated by a fierce personal rivalry with Montgomery. The Germans conducted a skillful fighting retreat and managed to evacuate over 100,000 troops across the Strait of Messina to the Italian mainland, along with their vehicles and equipment. The failure to prevent this evacuation would be criticized afterward. The invasion of Sicily had an immediate political consequence. On July 25th, the Italian Fascist Grand Council voted to remove Benito Mussolini from power. King Victor Emmanuel summoned Marshal Pietro Badoglio to form a new government. Mussolini was arrested. Italy began secret negotiations to surrender, though German forces in Italy were already preparing for exactly this eventuality. The Italian armistice was announced on September 8th, the day before the main Allied landings at Salerno on the Italian mainland. The Germans reacted swiftly. They disarmed the Italian army, occupied Rome, and rescued Mussolini in a daring glider raid on the Gran Sasso mountain in September, installing him as the puppet leader of a rump fascist state in northern Italy. The Italian campaign became a long, brutal slog. Churchill had described Italy as the soft underbelly of Europe, but the terrain was anything but soft. The mountainous spine of the peninsula, the narrow valleys, the rivers running across the Allied line of advance, and the winter weather all favored the defenders. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding the German forces in Italy, was a master of defensive warfare. He established a series of fortified lines across the peninsula, the most formidable of which was the Gustav Line, anchored on the monastery of Monte Cassino. The fighting at Cassino lasted from January to May 1944, encompassing 4 separate battles. The monastery, a Benedictine foundation dating from the 6th century, sat on a commanding hilltop overlooking the Liri Valley, through which the Allies needed to advance toward Rome. Whether the Germans were using the monastery itself as a defensive position was debated at the time. In February, the Allied commander, General Sir Harold Alexander, authorized the bombing of the monastery. On February 15th, over 200 bombers reduced the ancient building to rubble. The bombing was controversial and arguably counterproductive because the ruins provided better defensive positions than the intact buildings had. The Germans occupied the rubble and fought on. The stalemate at Cassino prompted Churchill to push for an amphibious landing behind the German lines. In January 1944, an Anglo-American force landed at Anzio, about 30 miles south of Rome, commanded by Major General John Lucas. The landing itself was virtually unopposed, but Lucas, cautious by nature and wary of overextending, chose to consolidate the beachhead rather than push inland immediately. Kesselring reacted quickly, surrounding the beachhead with German forces and launching fierce counterattacks. The unsealed beachhead became a trapped pocket under constant shell fire and air attack for 4 months. Churchill was disgusted by the lack of aggressiveness and remarked that instead of hurling a wildcat onto the shore, they had stranded a vast whale. Lucas was replaced in February by Major General Lucian Truscott, a more aggressive commander, but the beachhead remained contained until the spring. The breakthrough at Cassino finally came in May 1944, when Alexander launched a coordinated offensive using forces from over a dozen nations. The Polish Second Corps, commanded by General Władysław Anders, fought its way up the slopes of Monte Cassino and finally captured the ruined monastery on May 18th. French colonial troops under General Alphonse Juin broke through the Gustav Line in the Urumtsi Mountains. The German defences crumbled, and the forces at Anzio broke out. Rome fell on June 4, 1944, the first Axis capital to be liberated. The news was overshadowed almost immediately by the events of 2 days later. By late 1943, the stage was being set for the invasion of France. At the Tehran Conference in late November, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin met together for the first time. The conference took place in the Soviet embassy compound, and Stalin dominated the proceedings. The central question was Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion. Stalin pressed relentlessly for a firm date and wanted to know who would command it. Churchill had argued for continuing the Mediterranean strategy and had proposed additional operations in the eastern Mediterranean, including landings in the Dodecanese and support for partisans in the Balkans. Roosevelt sided with Stalin. Overlord would proceed in May 1944, and the Mediterranean would become a secondary theatre. Churchill accepted the decision, though he felt keenly that Britain was being outvoted by its larger allies. The balance of power within the alliance had shifted decisively. American industrial output and Soviet manpower dwarfed Britain's contribution, and the diplomatic leverage had followed. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force for Overlord. Churchill had privately hoped for a British commander, perhaps Brooke, but Roosevelt was providing the majority of the troops and resources, and an American would lead. Eisenhower established his headquarters at Southwick House near Portsmouth and assembled the largest invasion force in history. The preparations consumed the first half of 1944. Southern England became an enormous armed camp, packed with troops, tanks, aircraft, and the thousands of landing craft that would carry the assault force across the Channel. Churchill was closely involved in the planning and visited troops and installations frequently. He also engaged in a prolonged personal battle over his own desire to witness the invasion firsthand. He proposed to embark aboard HMS Belfast, a cruiser assigned to the bombardment force, and watch the landings from offshore. Eisenhower opposed this firmly, arguing that the risk to the Prime Minister was unacceptable and that his presence aboard a warship would create an impossible distraction for the naval commander. Churchill refused to back down. The argument escalated until King George VI intervened personally. The King wrote to Churchill pointing out that if the Prime Minister could go, then so could the King, and asking whether they should both risk being killed by enemy action. Churchill relented, with considerable reluctance. D-Day came on June 6, 1944. The invasion had been postponed by 24 hours due to bad weather. Eisenhower made the agonizing decision to go on the evening of June 5th, based on a brief forecast of improved conditions from his chief meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg. Churchill monitored the landings from his map room through the night and into the morning. Over 156,000 Allied troops crossed the Channel on the first day, landing on 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast. The American landings at Omaha Beach were the bloodiest, with heavy casualties from well-positioned German defenses on the bluffs above the beach. By the end of the day, the Allies had secured their footholds, though the situation at Omaha had been precarious for hours. Churchill visited the Normandy beaches on June 12, just 6 days after the landings. He crossed the Channel on a destroyer, toured Montgomery's headquarters, and briefly came under shellfire, which pleased him enormously. He returned to do it again on subsequent occasions. The joy of the successful landings was tempered within a week by a new threat. On June 13th, the first V-1 flying bombs hit London. These pilotless aircraft, launched from sites in northern France, carried a 1-ton warhead and flew at roughly 400 miles per hour. Their engine cut out over the target, and the silence before impact was terrifying. Over the following months, nearly 10,000 V-1s were launched against London and other targets. Anti-aircraft guns, barrage balloons, and fighter aircraft shot down many of them, and the defences improved steadily, but they caused significant casualties and serious damage to civilian morale. Over 6,000 people were killed by V-1 attacks. In September, the first V-2 rockets arrived. These were ballistic missiles, the first in history to be used in combat, and there was no defense against them. They traveled faster than the speed of sound, so there was no warning before impact. Over 1,000 V-2s struck England, killing nearly 3,000 people. Churchill considered retaliating with chemical weapons against the launch sites and production facilities, and he asked the military chiefs for a feasibility study. The chiefs of staff advised against it, on both practical and moral grounds. The stocks of chemical weapons were insufficient for a decisive effect, the Germans could retaliate in kind, and the use of poison gas would horrify world opinion. Churchill accepted their advice and the idea was dropped. Through the second half of 1944, the Allied armies fought their way across France and into the Low Countries and Western Germany. Paris was liberated on August the 25th. Brussels followed on September 3rd. But the advance slowed. Montgomery's ambitious plan to outflank the German defences by seizing a corridor of bridges through the Netherlands, Operation Market Garden, was launched on September 17th and ended in failure at Arnhem, where the British 1st Airborne Division was largely destroyed. The war would not be over by Christmas. Churchill's health was a growing concern. He turned 70 in November 1944. He had suffered a serious bout of pneumonia in Carthage, Tunisia, in December 1943 after the Tehran conference. His temperature had spiked dangerously, and Lord Moran brought specialists from Cairo. For several days, his life was in real doubt. Clementine flew out from England to be at his bedside. He recovered, but slowly, and those around him noticed that his stamina was diminished. He tired more easily. His concentration flagged in the evenings, and Brooke recorded in his diary that Churchill's powers were visibly declining. In February 1945, Churchill travelled to the Crimea for the Yalta Conference, the last meeting of the Big Three. Roosevelt was visibly dying. He was gaunt, hollowed out, and his attention wandered. Churchill was shocked by his appearance. Stalin, by contrast, was sharp, prepared, and in command of the room. The discussions covered the post-war settlement, the occupation zones in Germany, the structure of the proposed United Nations reparations, and the fate of Poland. Poland was the most contentious issue. Stalin had already installed a communist-dominated provisional government in Lublin, and the Red Army occupied the entire country. Churchill and Roosevelt pressed for free elections and the inclusion of members of the London-based Polish government in exile. Stalin agreed to language about free and unfettered elections, but the enforcement mechanism was vague. Churchill returned from Yalta uneasy, telling colleagues that the agreements were the best he could get, but that much depended on Soviet good faith. Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, in Warm Springs, Georgia. Harry Truman, the vice president, assumed the presidency. Churchill had no personal relationship with Truman and knew almost nothing about him. The loss of Roosevelt removed the figure who had been Churchill's most important ally and with whom he had built one of the defining partnerships of the war. Churchill wrote to Clementine that he felt a great sense of personal grief at the passing of the man who had been his friend and ally through the darkest years. Victory in Europe came on May 8, 1945. Germany had surrendered unconditionally the previous day at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, with a ratification ceremony in Berlin on May 8. Churchill broadcast to the nation at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, confirming that the war in Europe was over. He appeared on the balcony of the Ministry of Health in Whitehall, overlooking a vast crowd that filled the streets below. The celebrations were immense. Churchill addressed the crowd, led the singing of "Land of Hope and Glory," and told them that this was their victory. The crowd roared back that it was his. That evening, in private, Churchill's mood was sombre. He told Lord Moran that he did not feel the sense of triumph the occasion warranted. The problems ahead, the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, the shattered economies, the uncertain peace, weighed on him. The war against Japan continued. In July 1945, Churchill travelled to Potsdam, outside Berlin, for the final summit conference of the war, meeting with Truman and Stalin amid the ruins of the German capital. On July 16th, while the conference was in session, the United States successfully tested the first atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert, the Trinity test. Truman informed Churchill of the result. Churchill grasped the implications immediately, both military and geopolitical. The bomb could end the war with Japan without the need for an invasion that was expected to cost enormous casualties. Churchill gave British consent for the use of the bomb, as required under the Quebec Agreement of 1943, which had established Anglo-American cooperation on the atomic project. But by the time the bombs fell on Hiroshima on August the 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, Churchill was no longer Prime Minister. Part 6. The Shock of Defeat, the 1945 election. The Potsdam Conference was interrupted halfway through by the results of the British general election. Polling had taken place on July 5th, but the count was delayed 3 weeks to allow postal ballots from servicemen and women stationed around the world to arrive. Churchill flew back to London on July 25th for the results. He was confident of victory. The Conservative Party's private polling was optimistic, and Churchill believed that his personal standing as the man who had won the war would carry the day. Almost everyone around him shared this assumption. The American delegation at Potsdam half expected Churchill to return within a few days to resume the conference. The decision to hold an election had been Churchill's. The coalition government that had governed Britain since May 1940 was a wartime arrangement. With Germany defeated, the Labour Party saw no reason to continue it. At the Labour Party conference in Blackpool in late May, the delegates voted overwhelmingly to leave the coalition and fight an independent election. Churchill could have tried to maintain a caretaker coalition until the defeat of Japan, but Labour was unwilling. He called the election for July 5th and formed a caretaker government of Conservatives and non-party figures to govern in the interim. The campaign exposed a deep gulf between Churchill's understanding of the public mood and the reality on the ground. Churchill ran on his war record and on warnings about the dangers of socialism. His opening campaign, broadcast on June 4th, delivered on the BBC, contained the passage that came to define the election's most notorious moment. Churchill declared that a socialist government would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo to implement its programme. The comparison of the Labour Party, his coalition partners for 5 years, to the Nazi secret police landed badly. It struck many listeners as absurd and offensive. Clement Attlee, responding the following evening in his quiet, clipped, unemotional style, dismissed the attack with devastating understatement, suggesting that the voice of the night before had been that of Lord Beaverbrook rather than Churchill himself. Clementine had read the speech in advance and urged Churchill to remove the Gestapo passage. He refused. The Conservative campaign focused heavily on Churchill's personality and war leadership. Posters showed his face with the slogan, "Vote National, help him finish the job." The assumption was that gratitude for victory would translate into votes. Labour, by contrast, ran on policy. Their manifesto, titled "Let Us Face the Future," promised a national health service, full employment, a comprehensive system of social insurance, the nationalisation of key industries including coal, steel and the railways, and a massive programme of public housing. Labour's message was that winning the war was not enough. The peace had to be won too, and the peace meant building a society fundamentally different from the one that had produced the unemployment, poverty and social division of the 1930s. The mood among the armed forces was particularly striking. Millions of men and women in uniform had spent years fighting and had had ample time to think about what kind of country they wanted to come home to. The Army Bureau of Current Affairs, which organized educational discussions among troops, had exposed soldiers to ideas about social reform and reconstruction. The Beveridge Report of 1942, which proposed a comprehensive welfare state, had been enormously popular among servicemen. Many of them remembered the broken promises after the First World War, when Lloyd George had pledged homes fit for heroes and delivered mass unemployment. They were determined that this time would be different. The services voted overwhelmingly for Labour. Churchill spent the campaign touring the country in motorcades, drawing vast crowds wherever he went. The crowds cheered him, waved flags, and chanted his name. Churchill took this as evidence that he would win. But many of those who cheered him in the streets as a war leader had no intention of voting for him as a peacetime Prime Minister. The distinction between admiration for Churchill personally and support for the Conservative Party was one that Churchill and his advisers failed to grasp. The results began coming in on the morning of July 26th. Churchill was at the map room in the annex, following the returns as they arrived. By lunchtime, the scale of the disaster was clear. Labour was winning a landslide. Constituency after constituency that had been safely Conservative for decades was falling. Senior ministers lost their seats. The final result was staggering. Labour won 393 seats, the Conservatives 213. Labour had a majority of 146. It was the largest swing in British electoral history. Churchill was stunned. He had gone to bed the previous night, still expecting to win. According to his doctor, Lord Moran, Churchill told him over lunch that the British people had decided to throw him out. Clementine, trying to console him, suggested that the defeat might be a blessing in disguise. Churchill replied that at the moment it seemed quite effectively disguised. He resigns that evening, driving to Buckingham Palace to tender his resignation to the King. George VI offered Churchill the Order of the Garter, Britain's highest order of chivalry. Churchill declined, saying he could not accept the Order of the Garter when the people had just given him the Order of the Boot. He recommended that the King send for Attlee, which the King did. Attlee arrived at the palace, accepted the commission to form a government, and within hours was on his way to Potsdam to take Churchill's place at the conference table alongside Truman and Stalin. The transition was immediate, almost brutally so. Churchill was a private citizen. The defeat was a profound personal blow. Churchill had led the country through its greatest crisis and delivered victory, and the country had responded by removing him from office at the moment of triumph. He struggled to adjust. The routine that had sustained him for 5 years, the red boxes, the meetings, the telegrams, the constant flow of decisions, all stopped overnight. He was 69 years old, tired, and for the first time in years, purposeless. But this was Churchill, and purposelessness was not a condition that would last. Part 7. Opposition and the Return to Power. Churchill settled into opposition slowly and reluctantly. He remained leader of the Conservative Party and held his parliamentary seat for Woodford in Essex, but the daily grind of opposition politics held little appeal for a man who had directed the war effort from the map room. He attended the House of Commons intermittently and left much of the detailed work of opposing the Attlee government to his deputy, Anthony Eden, and to younger figures like Rab Butler and Harold Macmillan. His moods were dark in the months after the defeat. He drank heavily, painted at Chartwell, and accepted a string of invitations from abroad that kept him away from Westminster for long stretches. It was on one of these trips that he delivered the speech that did more than anything else to define the post-war world in the public mind. On March 5, 1946, Churchill spoke at Westminster College in the small town of Fulton, Missouri. President Truman sat beside him on the platform. Truman had personally invited Churchill and had travelled with him by train from Washington, playing poker along the way. Churchill used the occasion to deliver a sweeping assessment of the international situation. The key passage declared that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain had descended across the continent. Behind that line lay all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All were subject, in one form or another, to Soviet influence and control. The phrase Iron Curtain was not entirely new. It had been used before in various contexts, and Churchill himself had used it in a telegram to Truman in May 1945. But the Fulton speech gave the phrase its lasting power and framed the emerging Cold War in terms that ordinary people could understand. The reaction at the time was deeply mixed. Many American newspapers condemned the speech as warmongering. Left-wing opinion in Britain was hostile. Stalin compared Churchill to Hitler and accused him of calling for war against the Soviet Union. Attlee's government distanced itself carefully. But within a year or two, as Soviet actions in Eastern Europe, the communist coup in Czechoslovakia in 1948 and the Berlin blockade confirmed Churchill's analysis, the Fulton speech came to be seen as prescient rather than provocative. 6 months later, in September 1946, Churchill delivered another significant address, this time in Zurich, Switzerland. He called for the creation of a kind of United States of Europe built on a partnership between France and Germany. European unity, he argued, was the only way to prevent another catastrophic war on the continent. The speech was greeted with enthusiasm by European federalists, and Churchill became the figurehead of the European movement, presiding over the Congress of Europe at The Hague in 1948. But his vision of European integration always placed Britain outside the structure, as a sponsor and friend rather than a member. Britain, in Churchill's view, stood at the intersection of three great circles: the Empire and Commonwealth, the English-speaking world led by the United States, and Europe. It could encourage European unity without submerging itself within it. During the opposition years, Churchill threw his energy into writing. He had agreed to produce a history of the Second World War, and the project consumed him for the better part of 7 years. The work eventually ran to 6 volumes, published between 1948 and 1953, totaling over 2 million words. Churchill assembled a team of research assistants to help him. The historian Bill Deakin, who had worked with Churchill on his pre-war biography of Marlborough, was the most important in the early stages. General Henry Pownall, Commodore Gordon Allen, and others provided military expertise and helped draft sections on campaigns and operations. Churchill dictated much of the text himself during long sessions at Chartwell, pacing his study while a secretary typed. The books were part memoir, part history, and part self-justification. Churchill had unparalleled access to the documentary record, including his own wartime minutes and telegrams, and he used them to present his version of events. The narrative was powerful, readable, and inevitably shaped by Churchill's perspective. He was generous to allies when it suited him, and less generous to those with whom he had clashed, such as Wavell and Auchinleck. The books were commercially successful on both sides of the Atlantic and earned Churchill a substantial fortune. They also cemented his interpretation of the war in the public consciousness for a generation. The 1950 general election, held in February, produced an inconclusive result. Labour was returned to power, but with its majority slashed from 146 to just 5. The Attlee government staggered on for 20 months, exhausted by the crises of the post-war years: the fuel shortage of 1947, the Sterling crisis, the Berlin blockade, the Korean War, and deep internal divisions over the scale of the rearmament program. Attlee called another election for October 1951. Churchill campaigned hard. He was 76 years old and visibly aged, but the prospect of returning to Downing Street energized him. The Conservatives presented themselves as the party of competence and freedom, promising to end rationing, build 300,000 houses a year, and maintain the welfare state that Labour had created. Churchill worked to reassure voters that a Conservative government would not dismantle the National Health Service or roll back the major social reforms. The result was close. Labour actually won more votes nationally, but the Conservatives won more seats, 321 to Labour's 295. Churchill was back. He kissed hands with the King on October 26, 1951, and formed his second government. The second premiership was a very different affair from the first. There was no existential crisis to galvanise the nation, and Churchill's energies, while still remarkable for a man of his age, were diminished. He focused primarily on foreign affairs. The Cold War dominated the international landscape. Britain had tested its own atomic bomb in October 1952, and the hydrogen bomb was in development. Stalin's death in March 1953 opened what Churchill saw as a window for diplomacy. He became convinced that a summit meeting with the new Soviet leadership, conducted personally by the heads of state, could reduce the risk of nuclear war. He pushed for this summit repeatedly, but the Americans under Eisenhower, who had been elected president in November 1952, were skeptical. The French were preoccupied with Indochina. The summit never materialized during Churchill's premiership. Domestically, Churchill delegated extensively. Rab Butler, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, managed economic policy. Harold Macmillan, at the Ministry of Housing, delivered on the promise of 300,000 houses a year and built his reputation in the process. Churchill attended cabinet meetings, but increasingly let others drive domestic legislation. He was interested in the big questions: the bomb, relations with America and Russia, the future of the empire. The details of housing policy and industrial relations did not grip him the way they once might have. On the evening of June 23, 1953, Churchill hosted a dinner at number 10 for the visiting Italian Prime Minister Alcide de Gasperi. During the dinner, Churchill suffered a severe stroke. The left side of his face drooped, his left arm became weak, and his speech was slurred. He managed to finish the dinner, and the guests noticed something was wrong, but were told the Prime Minister was overtired. By the next morning, his condition had worsened significantly. He could barely walk. Lord Moran examined him and feared the worst. What followed was one of the most remarkable cover-ups in British political history. Churchill's inner circle decided to conceal the severity of his condition from the public. Lord Beaverbrook, Lord Camrose, who owned the Daily Telegraph, and Brendan Bracken, Churchill's old political ally, used their influence with the press to suppress the story. A brief statement was released saying that the Prime Minister was in need of rest. Churchill was taken to Chartwell to recover, away from the scrutiny of Westminster. For weeks, the true extent of his illness was known only to his family, his doctor, and a handful of political intimates. The timing was complicated by the fact that Anthony Eden, the heir apparent and Foreign Secretary, was himself gravely ill. Eden had undergone a series of operations on his bile duct in April 1953, one of which had gone badly wrong, nicking the duct and causing chronic infection and pain that would plague him for the rest of his life. Eden was convalescing in America and was in no position to take over. If Churchill's stroke had been made public, there would have been a succession crisis with no obvious candidate to step in. Churchill recovered remarkably. His constitution, built on decades of brandy, cigars, and sheer willpower, proved resilient once again. By August, he was chairing cabinet meetings at Chartwell. By October, he was well enough to deliver a 50-minute speech to the Conservative Party conference at Margate, a performance that reassured the party that their leader was still functioning. The recovery was not complete. He was slower, his concentration less reliable, and those who worked closely with him could see the decline. But he carried on. The question of when Churchill would resign now dominated the political life of the Conservative Party. Eden waited with growing frustration. He had been Churchill's designated successor for over a decade, and Churchill kept finding reasons to postpone his departure. He wanted to see through a summit with the Soviets. He wanted to attend one more conference. He wanted to mark the anniversary of some occasion or other. The cabinet grew restive. Senior ministers, including Macmillan and Lord Salisbury, made their views known. Churchill clung to office, reluctant to surrender the position he had fought so hard to regain. He finally resigned on April 5, 1955. The previous evening, he hosted a farewell dinner at number 10 for the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, a mark of personal respect from the sovereign to her first Prime Minister. The dinner was a glittering occasion. Churchill wore his Order of the Garter, which he had finally accepted in 1953. The Queen proposed a toast. The following day, Churchill drove to Buckingham Palace, tendered his resignation, and recommended that the Queen send for Eden. He returned to Chartwell. He did not give up his seat in Parliament. Part 8, The Long Sunset, 1955 to 1965. Churchill's retirement from Downing Street did not mean retirement from public life, at least not immediately. He remained the Member of Parliament for Woodford and won his seat again in the general election of May 1955, called by Eden shortly after taking over. He won it once more in the October 1959 election under Macmillan's leadership, though by then he barely attended the House of Commons. He sat in his usual corner seat below the gangway on the government side, and on the rare occasions he appeared, members on both sides would acknowledge him quietly. He said almost nothing in debate during these final years as a member. His time was spent between three places: Chartwell, his beloved country house in Kent, where he painted in his garden studio and fed the golden orf and his ponds; his London home at 28 Hyde Park Gate in Kensington, and the south of France, where he spent long holidays in the sun. He became a frequent guest of his literary agent Emery Reeves and Reeves's partner Wendy Russell at their villa, La Pausa, above Roquebrune on the Côte d'Azur. The villa had once belonged to Coco Chanel, and Churchill spent weeks there at a time, painting the Mediterranean light, reading, and playing cards. He also cruised the Mediterranean and the Caribbean repeatedly as the guest of the Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis aboard Onassis's yacht Christina. The yacht was one of the most luxurious private vessels in the world, and Churchill enjoyed the comfort, the company, and the warmth. Clementine disliked Onassis and rarely joined these cruises. She found the social atmosphere vulgar and worried about the impression it created. But Churchill was content, and at his age Clementine let the matter rest more often than not. Painting remained his greatest solace. He had taken it up in 1915 during the dark period after Gallipoli, and it had sustained him through every subsequent crisis. In retirement, he painted prolifically, working in oils on canvases that depicted the landscapes of southern France, Morocco, and the English countryside. His work was exhibited at the Royal Academy under a pseudonym, and his talent was genuine, if not profound. He found in painting a complete mental absorption that silenced the black dog of depression that had stalked him throughout his life. As his physical faculties declined, the brushes became harder to manage, and eventually even painting was beyond him. In 1953, while still serving as Prime Minister, Churchill had been awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. The Swedish Academy cited his mastery of historical and biographical description, as well as his brilliant oratory in defending exalted human values. Churchill did not attend the ceremony in Stockholm. Clementine accepted the prize on his behalf in December 1953, while Churchill was still recovering from his stroke. The prize recognized a body of work that included The World Crisis, his account of the First World War, Marlborough, His Life and Times, the Second World War, and A History of the English-Speaking Peoples, the last of which was finally completed and published in 4 volumes between 1956 and 1958, based on a manuscript he had largely written before the war. Churchill's family life in these final years was a mixture of warmth and sorrow. His marriage to Clementine had endured for over half a century. They had married in September 1908, and their partnership, though strained at times by Churchill's absorption in politics and Clementine's fierce independence, was the most important personal relationship of his life. Clementine had managed the household, raised the children largely on her own during Churchill's long absences, served as his most honest critic, and provided the emotional anchor he needed. She was not sentimental about him. She told him when he was wrong, sometimes in letters of striking bluntness that she would write and then debate whether to send. She had sent enough of them to make her point over the decades. Their children's lives had been difficult. The oldest surviving daughter, Diana, had struggled with depression throughout her adult life. Her marriage to the conservative politician Duncan Sandys ended in divorce in 1960. On October 20th, 1963, Diana died by suicide at her home in London. She was 54. Churchill was told of her death, and those around him said he took the news in silence. He attended the funeral, but was visibly diminished by grief. Their son, Randolph, had inherited his father's combativeness and ambition, but lacked the discipline and political judgment that had carried Churchill through his own early setbacks. Randolph drank heavily, quarrelled with almost everyone, and failed repeatedly to establish a political career of his own, losing multiple parliamentary elections. His relationship with his father was intense and painful. Randolph adored Churchill and craved his approval, which was given inconsistently. In his later years, Randolph channeled his energies into writing an authorized biography of his father, a project of enormous scale. He completed 2 volumes covering Churchill's life up to 1914, before his own death in 1968. The biography was continued and completed by the historian Martin Gilbert. Their daughter Sarah had a career as an actress, but also suffered from alcoholism and unhappy relationships. Their youngest daughter, Mary, was the most stable of the Churchill children. She married the conservative politician Christopher Soames, enjoyed a settled family life, and became her father's most devoted companion in his old age. Mary was often at Chartwell and at Hyde Park Gate during Churchill's final years, and she later wrote a biography of her mother. Churchill's physical decline accelerated through the late 1950s and into the 1960s. He suffered a series of small strokes that progressively dimmed his faculties. His hearing deteriorated. His speech, already affected by the 1953 stroke, became increasingly difficult to follow. He spent longer periods sitting in silence, staring into the fire at Chartwell or gazing out of the window at Hyde Park Gate. Lord Moran continued to attend him regularly and recorded his observations in a diary that would later be published, controversially, as a memoir of his years as Churchill's doctor. The publication caused anger among the Churchill family, who felt that Moran had betrayed medical confidences. Churchill's last visit to the House of Commons came on July 27, 1964. He was helped to his seat and sat for a short while before being assisted out again. Members stood as he left. It was understood that he would not return. When the general election came in October 1964, Churchill did not stand. The seat at Woodford, which he had held since 1945, passed to a new Conservative candidate. His parliamentary career, which had begun in 1900 when he won Oldham as a 25-year-old, was over after 64 years. On January 10, 1965, Churchill suffered a massive stroke at his home in Hyde Park Gate. He lost consciousness and did not regain it. He lingered for 14 days, his breathing growing steadily weaker while the world waited. Bulletins were issued from the house. Crowds gathered in the street outside. On the morning of Sunday, January 24, 1965, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill died. He was 90 years old. The date was exactly 70 years to the day after the death of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill. Churchill's was the first state funeral for a non-royal in Britain since the Duke of Wellington's in 1852, over a century earlier. Queen Elizabeth II broke with protocol by attending. Traditionally, the sovereign does not attend the funerals of subjects, but the Queen decided that this occasion warranted the exception. She arrived at St. Paul's Cathedral before the coffin, another breach of convention since royal etiquette required that the monarch arrive last. By arriving first, the Queen was in effect waiting for Churchill, a gesture of personal respect. The funeral was held on January 30, 1965. The coffin, draped in the Union flag, was carried on a gun carriage through the streets of London from Westminster Hall, where Churchill had lain in state for 3 days. Over 300,000 people had filed past the catafalque. The route to St. Paul's was lined with mourners standing in bitter cold. Representatives from 112 countries attended the service. The congregation included heads of state, wartime commanders, and ordinary servicemen who had fought under Churchill's leadership. After the service, the coffin was taken from St. Paul's to the Tower of London, where it was placed aboard the Port of London Authority launch, Havengore, for the journey up the Thames to Waterloo Station. As the Havengore passed through the Pool of London, the cranes of the London docks dipped their jibs in salute. The dockers had arranged this themselves. From Waterloo, a special train carried the coffin to the village of Bladon in Oxfordshire. Churchill was buried in the churchyard of St. Martin's, within sight of the walls of Blenheim Palace, where he had been born 90 years before. His parents, Lord Randolph and Jenny, lay beside him, along with his brother Jack, who had died in 1947. Clementine survived him by 12 years. She was created Baroness Spencer Churchill in her own right, and died on December 12, 1977, at the age of 92. She was buried beside her husband at Bladon. Churchill's life had spanned the reign of 6 monarchs, from Victoria to Elizabeth II. He had fought in 4 wars on 3 continents. He had served in Parliament for 64 years and as Prime Minister for nearly 9. He had written over 40 books and produced over 500 paintings. He had sent and received tens of thousands of letters and telegrams. He had drunk oceans of champagne and smoked mountains of cigars. He had experienced triumph and catastrophe, sometimes within the same week. He had been cast out of office and called back, celebrated and condemned, trusted and doubted. He had led a nation through the most perilous chapter in its history, and he had done so by the force of his will, his words, and his refusal to contemplate defeat. And when the country needed him most, in the summer of 1940, he had been there. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.